Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I had absolutely no idea how to pitch this because I was a little bit unsure what the demographics were. So whose work works at the university in computer vision? Who just works at the university? So who knows nothing about computer vision at all? Okay, we might have got the pitch right then. So it's a bit of a grand title, but that was hopefully to try and capture, well, people's imagination. So in terms of, I think the real question is always how to pitch a talk. And what I am terrible at doing is death by PowerPoint. So generally what happens is that you have the opportunity to speak and you want to talk about as much of your work as possible and sound as clever as possible. And what you end up with is a completely incoherent mass of slides where you go through project after project after project, and I don't think it's particularly fun. So over the last few years, I've been making a conscious effort not to do that, but it's very hard because we're all self-promoters. Now, the other way to do it is CV bashing, right? And by that I mean computer vision bashing, and that always seems to go down quite well. So actually, if you take your field and start to pick holes in it, then generally people quite like that. Whether that's the best thing to do is a different matter. But what I've tried to do is just focus on a couple of current projects. So rather than giving you death by PowerPoint, I'm just talking really about two areas of work that's currently ongoing. That's sign language and kind of the autonomous vehicles. And I'm trying to wrap that up in a kind of bigger story of how the field has evolved and where we're going. And that kind of hopefully then is a bit more appealing to a more general audience. Now, whether I've got the pitch right, you'll make that decision at the end. So just in terms of what I'm going to talk about, a very brief intro to CVSSP, where I'm from. I've got, you've seen this slide before, my history of CV, which I love, which is a great slide just to get us going. I said I'm going to talk a little bit about sign language and how that's kind of developed, sign language recognition, a bit about the work we're currently doing on autonomous cars and robots, and then kind of where we're going as a field, where I feel we still need to put the work in. So CVSSP is the Centre for Vision, Speech, Signal Processing at the University of Surrey. I see some alumni in the audience. Yeah, so if you want a strap line, well, this is one of our marketing slides. So it's creating machines that can see, hear, understand the world around them. It's been around for a while. It was founded back in '87 by Joseph Kittler. Joseph kind of handed over the reins in 2012 to Adrian, at which point, and he did that to go back to research, at which point, out of sheer madness, he became the head of department, which of course is exactly what you would do. He did that for a while, managed to dump that, went into retirement, then pulled in more grants than he had done probably in the last 10 years, came back out of retirement, and now is a research powerhouse again. But CVSSP is quite big. Actually, I mean, the last thing I did before I left today was have a staff meeting where I was told 125 has now gone up to 165. We've run out of space, and we're desperately trying to find more office space for the group. It's kind of broadly broken into sort of different labs, and the way we try and pitch ourselves is there's kind of this core machine learning, AI, and then it's kind of application to a number of different areas. So there is audio in there, there's Joseph with the biometrics. I'm going to talk about my stuff in the C lab, all the way through to medical imaging and touching on graphics as well. But this kind of, you know, the core technology is there, and you can think of these as application areas. I think it's a bit artificial. I mean, CVSSP is actually a really nice place to work, and I think we're probably famous within the university for being one of the most collegiate places. So actually there's enough, you know, crosses that go between people in this that really this is just about the application area. So the Cognitive Vision Lab is kind of where I live, and it's a bit of a... Historically, I shied away from hardware. We did very well sort of early on in terms of EU projects in cognitive vision, and a lot of these ones, CogVisys, Cospel, Eurus, Diplex, these were all kind of cognitive robotics. But we generally relied on overseas partners to provide the hardware, and we concentrated on the higher level perception, the understanding, and the software. And there's lots of good reasons for doing that, because if you have ever had any hardware in your research, you realise that it is a complete pain in the arse. And actually, if you want to do research, then working on data and software is a very good way to do it. But times have changed, the funding landscape's changed, Brexit changed a lot of things. And so actually what we've been doing over the last few years is trying to build up a bit more. So we do have a little robotics lab now, where we've got some test beds in there. We're trying to rely less on external partners for the hardware. I'm going to talk a bit about projects. These are the kind of current projects that we're doing. I think just in terms of me, and this would be your death by PowerPoint, and this goes back to those words of kind of the areas I've worked in. That if you go through everything, then this is kind of just a bulletproof list of all of the things that I've kind of worked on. And like a lot of academics, generally we will try and work. We will work on as many things as somebody will fund us to work on generally. But although this may look eclectic to you, it doesn't to me. For me, this is all about people. So, the stuff over here, people, lip reading, non-verbal communication, sign, gesture, and then over here, the surveillance stuff is still about people. It's just at a different level. And even when it comes down to learning, a lot of the learning that we've done is about learning from people. So watching how somebody, and some of the work I'll talk about in terms of autonomous vehicles is actually watching somebody drive the car and then learning what it is perceptually that's important, using that as a very weak supervision. Today, all I'm going to talk about is just sign and a bit of this stuff about autonomous control. So we start with a brief history of time. Actually, and maybe I should start with AI. Actually, you forgot to say we need to have, so what is AI? AI is a really bizarre thing. I put it in the title because the world has gone AI mad. It's a buzzword. Everyone, we're all doing AI. We've always been doing AI. But AI, 5 years ago, was an outdated term that you would not dream of putting into a research grant. We did, and my title is Computer Vision and Machine Learning, because machine learning was cool. And it's the popular media that has really brought back AI and created this thing. But we've all been doing AI all along. And actually, vision started back in AI. So if you kind of look at the classic, the classic quote is that, well, in about 1966, I think it was the summer of 1966, a AI lab, MIT, said, right, I'm going to have a summer project on computer vision. It'll be finished by the end of the summer, and vision will be solved, and we can all move on. We can get back to doing proper AI. And so, of course, that didn't happen. It turned out to be slightly more tricky than they thought. But you could say this at the beginning, but you could trace it back a little bit earlier. So you can go back even to the 1950s. Some of this work, early work by Gibson on optical flow and ego motion and things like that. But then what happens? Well, actually, before 1950s, I've got BCV. What does that stand for? Before computer vision. So back here, there was just monkeys in deserts with bones beating on monoliths. There's no sort of nothing interesting going before 1950. But as we move forward, and this is not exhaustive, I've just picked some of the kind of key landmarks. So a machine vision course arrives at MIT, David Marsh and some popular names. Neural networks, ooh, they were of interest, and then they didn't live up to their promises, so they disappeared. Ransack, Harris, face recognition, AdaBoost, support vector machines, SIFT, so these are all kind of common things that we would recognize. Depends how long you've been in the field. But, boosting, the Viola Jones face detector, HOG, histogram of gradients, we're going to look at that. And then, actually, there's some key points here. So 2011, Connect brings computer vision to the living room. And 2014, Slam and a vacuum cleaner. And I really like these two examples because these are examples where computer vision is in our household. It's actually come to fruition. It's doing something important. But, of course, in 2012, neural networks came back and the world goes deep learning mad again. And all of us that have been here, so, when did I come into this? I don't know, somewhere around about here. You know, sort of, oh, it's a fad, it'll go away. But the trouble is it's not. It's here to stay for the moment. We're going to talk a bit about that. So BGG, you know, and I could add huge amounts to this because the field really has exploded. You know, and ECCV this year, as with last time, you know, it's sold out before the early bird registration. I mean, people are, you know, the conferences are huge, and they're just swamped by industry using them as a recruitment exercise. Now, if you want to kind of summarize this, then what we can say is that actually in these early years, vision really was kind of, you know, part of AI. And then what happened is it started to break away, and we've got physics, geometry, and optimization. So it was a lot of projective geometry, and then it moved into machine learning and applications, and then big data, you know. So, and this was limited by the fact that you needed the data. So we got big data, we saw the data set start to get larger and larger, and the performance get better and better. And then, of course, we've got this deep learning, right, which is really now taken over. And the trouble is, whether you like it or not, and there is something very unsatisfying about sticking some data into a black box and getting a result out and not being able to compete with it and it not being interpretable, but you can't get away from the fact that actually it performs extremely well, right? So it's something that we're going to have to live with. But there's lots of things it can't do, and we will talk about that later on. Of course, off in the distance, 2045, we've got the singularity, right? So at this point, it's the end of the world. The machines take over. Slightly panicked until I realized, oh, actually, I'm retired. It's not my problem. As long as I've built my bunker by then, I'll be fine. Which futurologist? What is a futurologist? Which futurologist you believe as to where the singularity is coming? You know, this date varies, but something is on the horizon where AI is going to be great. Now, the question is, how do we get from where we are now to there? And I don't know, I'm constantly flipping about whether yeah, it's going to happen or whether it isn't. Certainly, we've still got some work to do before we get there. So there's your kind of intro. Now, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about sign language. Now, sign language is something that I've been working on since my PhD. And I've spent years learning how to sign. And I always thought that was a good investment because this is something that would keep me going until I was retired. The progress we've made in the last few years, I'm not so sure. I think it's going to be pretty much solved in the fairly near future. So I'm going to have to find something else to keep me pootling away into my senior years. But sign language recognition, well, sign language in general, if you're not familiar, it is a language in its own right. So it's not just about taking a sentence in English and translating a sign for a word. It has its own grammar. It has its own grammatical constructs. There is finger spelling, and you wouldn't believe how many papers I get that says sign language recognition in the title, and actually it just turns out to be a finger spelling paper. But that's a fairly small part of the language. What we're familiar with is the manual parts, and that's really when people are doing sign language recognition. So it's things like, you know, that is the citation form in BSL for far. But actually it's the non-manuals that make it much more, well, give it the colour and the flavour and the meaning. So I can change that citation form. I can say, and that means it's a long way. I can put a little nod and eyebrow raise to ask, you know, is it far? And so I can change the meaning of that one form. But then you've got, in continuous recognition, you've got other grammatical constructs which actually don't have any analogy in speech. You've got multi-channel sign, we've got placement, you've got role shift or constructed action, where I might place individuals, or, you know, I've got directional verbs, so I can have a person in space, I can have a place, I can sail from, you know, that person would sail from one place to another. You know, I can use the topology around me to actually tell part of the story. And these are all things that, you know, it's very difficult to foresee how simply sticking some data into a black box is going to get you to the solution. But all of the problems have always been about you know, lack of data, lack of linguistic understanding, and this fact that it's multi-channel. It's not just about the hand motion. It's also about the non-manual features, the gesture, the facial expression, etc., etc. But back in the early days when we started on this, we did turn to linguistics. And I always quite like that because it gives you an awful lot of power to look at the representations that the linguists use to describe things. And the power is actually in terms of generalization. So we always would have some image processing, and then we would try and express what was going on in the video at some kind of a phonetic level. And that phonetics would generally be either machine learned or defined by linguists, or some hybrid of the two. And then we would have a second stage classification which would actually look at the temporal sequence in the phonemes. And this worked very well, you know, for years. It gave us very good generalization, etc., etc. And from about 2004 to 2010, we really concentrated on the manual components of sign. So it really was about the hand motions, and it was about getting it to generalize across individuals and trying to do the continuous domain, which is non-trivial. So we tried lots of things. But it was only fairly recently we started to look at the non-manuals. And so this started with some work on mouthings. And the trouble is that when it comes to the non-manuals, there's very little annotated data in terms of linguistic study. And there's lots of arguments about, you know, in linguistics about what some of these things are. You know, eye gaze is an indication of indexing. Is it really? Well, it's lots of other things as well. So, I mean, maybe I should get a plug. So we've just got a new project which has started called Extol, which builds on kind of long-term collaboration with Zisman at Oxford in terms of the sign work. But importantly, it's with DCAL at UCL. And DCAL are the kind of BSL, you know, linguistic, you know, it's the centre in the UK. They've got a big data set, which is only partly annotated. And so actually, this new grant is about, it is a relationship, right? They want tools to help them annotate, and out of that annotation, we want to inform the models that we're going to train on that data. Because I do firmly believe that just throwing data at the problem gets us a long way, as we're going to see, but it's not going to fully solve the problem, just throwing it at a black box. So we started looking at the non-manuals. So mouthings is an easy one to do, because although we haven't got any annotation, mouthings, you know, you've got mouth gestures, so that's a mouth gesture, but a mouthing is typically where you mouth part of the word. So an example might be mountain, but I might mouth mountain, or I might mouth Alps or Everest. And actually what takes that single sign and turns it into Alps, you know, all of these other words in terms of a translation, is this kind of artifact on the lip. And it is an artifact of the spoken language, but it is also highly variable because it depends on whether you are deaf from the deaf community, whether you are hearing. So a hearing person will tend to mouth much more of a word than a deaf person. Deaf person probably will only just use a single mouth shape to depict that sign because they've learnt off somebody else, where the hearing person knows that actually it's coming from this word. So you've got huge amounts of variability, and we did some work looking. So this is an easy thing to do because you don't need the annotation, right? All we need is the source translation, and that tells us what we should be expecting to see on the lips. So some of the early work we did, which was ECCV 2014, started to look at these mouthings and whether we could force align those mouthings to the data, because what you've got is data with no annotation. We've got an idea of what patterns we should be seeing, and so you can take some of the tools that you would use in traditional speech, which is forced alignment, and start to iterate through the data. So you train a model, and then you realign, and then you train the model and you realign. And so it kind of automatically starts to partition the data up. And then this was a key thing in 2015 where we moved to CNNs. And there is an evolution here now. So this was work done by Oscar Koller-Arkin, who I was working with at the time. And Arkin is very much a speech group. And so the first thing was to effectively take a traditional HMM framework with its Viterbi decoding, all of the tools that you would use, but to replace the Gaussian emission probabilities of that HMM with effectively a CNN, right? So take the power of deep learning in terms of representing that input and and the rest of the framework was fairly standard. You know, so the HMM was still looking at the temporal evolution. We still had the same sort of decoding, the same forced alignment. But this worked really well. So what you do is you start with this flat start. We train the data on it, and then you go back through the data and you say, well, how well did it explain it? You do the realignment. All of these little time boundaries start to move around, and you iterate this process. And what you end up with at the end of the day is basically quite a detailed way of cutting up that data to say, well, this is this shape, this is this shape, this is this shape. And we'd done it for the lips, and then we did it for hands. And this was really the key to sort of scaling up to unannotated data, because what we could do is take a video, and of course a video's got lots of frames in it, and magically now annotate pretty much all of those frames in continuous sequences to get up to 1 million hands that we could train a CNN on. And then what you end up with is, for the first time, we had something that could actually cope with the huge amounts of variability of the hand. Hands were always a real pain in the arse because they're generally very low resolution. They're the things that move the quickest. You know, there's huge amounts of motion blur. But the CNN is particularly good. You know, it'll cope with whatever data you throw at it. So if we give it a blurred sequence and tell it it needs to classify it as this hand, then it will do its best. So this is just looking at the maximum, you know, the most likely hand shape that's coming out of that CNN on a frame-by-frame basis. There's no temporal smoothing, and it's doing fairly well. And this was the Phoenix data that it was trained on. This is just some completely random sequence taken off the web and applying the same thing. And of course, although that was the 1 million hands classifier, and we've used it an awful lot, we also put it into a recognition framework, and we started to push up. I remember on that Phoenix data, the error rates, you know, we were talking about 80% error rates when we started, and now it's like 20% error rates. You know, gradually, things that this data when we started was just so hard, and already, I wouldn't say we're saturating yet, but we're getting there. And then this is kind of doing the same thing. So this is Gian in my lab, but what we've done is we've taken out that HMM and the forced alignment. So this is now, you've still got the CNNs, but instead of a HMM, we've got some other machine learning here, some other neural networks, some LSTMs, and we've got this CTC loss layer, which allows it to cope with the fact that the time alignment isn't fully solved. And what this now means, you know, this is an end-to-end sequence-to-sequence model. So you can just put data in, a sequence, a video sequence, and you can put a sequence of hand shapes in, and not worry about the time alignment. This thing will worry about it for you. The disadvantage is this. So you can see, if it was, when we do the forced alignment in a kind of HMM, effectively it aligns every single frame, and you're training it on every single frame. The problem here in this sequence to sequence is that CTC loss layer only needs to find one hook in that sequence to say, yep, that's it, I now know what it is. And so the CNN itself is not as strong as it would be if we trained on an individual frame. But if you want to do if you want to recognize the temporal sequence, then it works well. Now, what's happened lately is that's a sequence-to-sequence method. We started playing with encoder-decoders. And that's allowed us for the first time to actually tackle the translation problem. All of the stuff we did before is recognition, and recognition is no use to anybody. Recognition, all we're doing is saying, here's a video sequence, they did this sign, they did this sign, they did this sign, they did this sign. And when I started, I said it's a language in its own right. So here what you've got is a video. Here what you've got is the sign gloss. So this is how the annotator would say, yeah, well, that's that sign, that's that sign, that's that sign. And this is the German translation, and with an English translation of the German, it's German data. So, and what you can see is that there isn't just a one-to-one mapping. It's got its own structure. And what we want to do is not go from here to here, which is recognition. We want to go do the full translation. We want the machine to see the video and to give us a spoken language translation that we understand. So let's not talk about the data. Now, the way we've done that is with, again, a sequence-to-sequence approach, but this is an encoder-decoder. So what you've got is the video coming in here. We've still got CNNs. And then you've got this kind of codependence in these two RNNs, and the idea is that this side of it encodes it to some latent space, and then this side decodes it into the target language. And this thing is trained end to end. So we put video in, we put the target language in, and the machinery inside worries about how it all works. What you do have is, there's a little attention layer in here, so it's allowed to decide what order it's going to peak, and that just allows it to cope. But this was really exciting because this is the first paper that was ever a full translation from one to the other. And I'm not going to go through the numbers. There's some examples here. So this is a ground truth. It's very small. And then we've got sort of different ways of either going straight from the video to text or going via this intermediate gloss layer. And actually, at the moment, that's where we are. We still need that intermediate layer to constrain the learning. All right? And that means that we still need the annotation. Once we've cracked that and got away from that, I can just train this damn thing on TV. We can give it millions of hours, not millions of frames. But actually what's interesting is that what we've been talking about here is effectively text to gloss. Gloss to text. Yeah, gloss to text, because there's a video, and then we've got this tokenization layer, which is gloss level, and then this encoder decoder is just a fairly standard piece of neural machine translation that's going from one target language to another. And what's interesting, you can go in both directions, and they work in exactly the same way. So this sort of says, well, actually, if we go from video to language, can we go from language to video? And this is Steph's paper that you saw at BMVC. So if you look at avatars, I'm not going to criticize people's research. But there's two parts to an avatar. One, making it look nice, and then two, getting it to sign. And so I would say that in most of these cases, the emphasis was not on it making it look pretty, but it was actually the sign generation. But it's perhaps not surprising that the deaf community aren't particularly enamored of this level. What you've got here is the current state of the art. This is Paula, and this is a procedural animation. So it's, it looks much better, but it's still very robotic. What the deaf community love is this thing over here. That's what they like. That looks brilliant, right? Of course, what's that? That's motion capture data, right? So that was a human, stood in front of it. Well, I'm teaching you how to suck eggs, but it was recorded to within inches of its life, and then it probably went through a whole load of post-production as well, cleaning that up in order to produce what looks like a lovely animation. So you kind of got this gulf between, well, the deaf want that. Of course you do. It looks brilliant. Yeah, it's really expressive. But you've got to be able to generate this on the fly, and once you start to do it procedurally, it starts to look robotic like this. Of course, again, neural networks, we've got things like GANs, generative adversarial networks, and these are systems that allow us to synthesize images. So here's an example taken as a constraint, some semantic segmentation, and here's an image that the network has generated that satisfies that constraint. And here's some examples here of generating animals. So the question is, well, if we can do it for images, why can't we do it for video? And this is very early work. So this is Steph's only in her first year of a PhD. Well, she's just finished her first year. But what we've got down here is effectively a GAN, which is conditioned on pose. So we've got an encoder, decoder, slightly different one now. It's like a little hourglass. And the purpose of this thing is to go via some embedding. And what we can do is we can change what this network is going to generate. And this is stuck in, because it's a GAN, so there's the generator, there's a discriminator, and we basically, it's a kind of little game. This system sits there looking at examples that it's generated itself, looking at real examples, and then trying to work out which is the real and which is the fake. And by doing that, it feeds that back into its learning, and it gets better and better and better at fooling itself, basically, that it's producing proper video. So we've got a piece of NMT at the beginning, and this is what I was talking about before. So this takes German and produces gloss. At the moment, this is the bit that stops it being end-to-end. So this here, we've just got some lookup tables. So this allows us to map from a sign to a sequence, and then we put that sequence into this conditional GAN in order to generate the video. And at the moment, we're working on fixing this bit, because then we can train this on vast amounts of data and scale it up. But already it's looking quite good. So what we've done here, this is a sequence. So the gloss, ground truth, north wind, moderate coast. You know, there is some German translation. This is the signer. What we've got over here is this German sentence put into the NMT and then the video automatically generated. And actually, although you can't see the full details of the hands and the face because it's very low resolution, this is pretty damn close to what the signer is saying. So we know we're on the right. And the deaf community think this is brilliant because it looks like a human. It doesn't look like a little piece of mechanical graphics. So there's a couple more examples. Actually, there's some interesting, maybe it's worth pointing this out. So this one here is just the GAN if you take the open pose. So this is the pose estimates from this video and just condition the, say produce these poses. And you see the hand jumping up here. That's where open pose has failed. And it says the hand needs to be over here. And so the GAN just goes, okay, you told me to put the hand over there. I put the hand over there. But obviously it's disconnected because it's never seen any data that would have the hand detached. Now the nice thing about this as well is that we can change the appearance of the signer. So what we're going for is that actually you'd be able to choose the signer, and you could put any image of yourself in, and then you can produce videos of you signing. Okay, so that was the sign language stuff, and hopefully what you saw there was a transition from kind of older style stuff through to the machine learning, and then a little bit about autonomous vehicles. So back in 2007, 2010, we had an EU project called Diplex, and this was with Autoliv, and Autoliv, a Swedish company, own a lot of the patents on things like airbags, and it was all about driver safety. And actually one of the reasons it was about driver safety was back in 2010, the thought that there would be a vehicle on the road that would be autonomously controlling itself was just absolute fantasy. That would never happen. Imagine the health and safety nightmare. All it took was a couple of, I was going to say nutters, but let's say a couple of people with lots of money and a view of the future to make us all believe that, oh, it is going to happen anyway, so we better get on with it. But back then we were focused more on driver safety rather than continuous control, so much so that we weren't allowed to drive Autoliv's car autonomously. And so what I did is I took a load of remote control cars and I hotwired them. And so this will do 35 miles, did 35 miles an hour. And actually, the reason it looks so Heath Robinson is this is a polycarbonate shell, and these are just bits of foam, because the first time it was under autonomous control, it drove itself into a wall at 35 miles an hour, and it took me quite a long time to rebuild all the shock absorbers and put the thing back together again. So, but where we started with this is that we had lots of data of drivers driving a car around Sweden, right? And that car was instrumented, so we had the vision of what the person could see, we had their control, we were recording the CAN bus, we even had things like skin resistivity, right? So how much they were sweating while driving. And importantly, we had the eye gaze. And I thought, oh, this is brilliant, this is ace. So we can take this data and we can do some behavioral stuff, because that's the sort of thing that interests me, and we can do some behavioral stuff and we'll look at where people are looking at. And the first thing I did was I built a visualizer that basically plotted the data, and it plotted the video, and it put a crosshair where the person was looking at, and we watched it, and we went, oh yeah, look, they're looking at that, they're looking at that, oh yeah, all made perfect sense. And then I realised that I'd made a mistake and the two things were 30 seconds out. So I took the 30 seconds offset out and we watched it again, and you could still sit there and you could still convince yourself that they were looking at sensible things. And the truth of the matter is that eye gaze was almost useless, because as a driver, you spend most of your time just staring sort of down the road. You don't actually look at things at all. You don't attend, only when you stop at the traffic lights, you know, you might attend to the traffic light. Somebody pulls out, you look at it. Most of the time you're doing it, you know, all of us who drive, you're doing it fairly subconsciously, aren't you? You know? And I remember in my first driving lesson, it was just look at the horizon, look at the vanishing point of the road, look as far ahead as possible, and that way you'll stay on the road. Don't look at the pothole, because that's the in the road, that's the easiest way to hit it. So what we did is we started off with GIST. We sort of said, well, rather than looking at the gaze, what can we learn just by looking at the vision as a whole? Now, there is something called GIST, which some of you may have come across, and it has a slightly different definition in computer vision as it might do in psychology. But in computer vision, it's kind of what can what can you gather from a scene with very coarse image statistics, and that, you know, there's several incarnations of this kind of idea of gisting, you know, just basically computing something about an image that captures some coarse statistics about it. The idea is that it's kind of, you know, it's biologically plausible, and there's lots of analogies between these kind of lower levels of human or primate vision. But what I start with is some work from MIT back in 2001, and they were using this GIST to try and categorize scenes, right? So there's various different forms of GIST, you know, so it might be steerable, wavelets, Gabor filters, even HOG, but something where you're basically computing quite coarse edge orientations, you know, different orientations, different scales over the image. And then what you can start to do is you can start to try and classify different parts of the scene. And, you know, not surprisingly, it's quite good at sort of, you know, man-made environments versus nature. If you think about the statistics of that scene, you know, nature's got lots of curves, man-made environments got lots of straight lines. They tend to be, you know, horizontal, vertical, so not rocket science. You then got some work which was kind of Fei Li, this was part of a PhD, although, again, I mean, you know, there's other work. You've got to be careful. If I was talking to a psychologist, they'd go, oh, it was done much better in psychology, sort of 10 years before. So, and she was doing some work where, with very brief exposures. And so the experiments were, there was like random noise, fixation point, an image was flashed at you for some amount of time, and then it went back to the fixation point and random noise, and then you were asked to categorize what you saw in the image. And so what you start to see is what people can get from a scene with very little attention, right? So it's this kind of pre-attentive vision. And so, you know, at 100 milliseconds, it's not possible for you to scan over this image. You're just, you know, you're flashed, it falls on your retina. And what you can say about the image depends an awful lot on the image, right? So actually, if you look at this one, between 100 milliseconds and 500, there's not a huge amount of difference. And part of the reason for that is that this is a fairly high contrast image. It's a dog. I mean, even in the 100 milliseconds, you get the fact there was something in his mouth. Had a ball in his mouth with longer time. In fact, it's even worse on this side, isn't it? Carrying a grey, oh no, you get the fact it's a frisbee. Down here, of course, this one is slightly different. So, and that's to do, this is a much more complex scene. And actually this takes longer for you to basically comprehend, shall we say. But there's an awful lot that can be done just from these very coarse statistics. So what we started off with this data was, well, let's take our images and then let's gist them, right? And we looked at various different ones. We started off with, I think it was Fourier transform or Gabor, and then actually we ended up with just HOG, and actually it didn't really matter sort of what the representation was. This was prior deep learning, so we're using random forest, but what we did is we went through and we started trying to learn things. Actually, one thing that we did that was clever was the way we encoded these things, and that meant that they were reversible. So we could look at what decisions were being made by the classifier and then back project them to the image to produce these kind of activation maps that says this part of the image is important for this decision. And then we started doing some fairly standard things. So we sort of said, well, okay, these gists, you know, they're designed to urban versus countryside. So I should be able to, you know, train it to recognize context. And it does fairly well. So these are ROC curves. If you don't know what an ROC curve is, basically you're plotting true positives against false positives. A random monkey sticking a pin in an image would give you a 45-degree line. A perfect system would give you like a nice 90-degree line here. And so what you can see that for T-junctions, it's not very good, but actually it's really good at detecting pedestrian crossings and pretty good at finding crossroads. And so that's just based on these core statistics. And that's not surprising because that's what it was designed for. Here we're looking at kind of whether it's effectively a motorway or inner urban. And then we thought, well, let's push our luck. So what about actually controlling the car? Can we get it to do that? So we took steering left, steering right, turning left, and this is just really quantizing. So steer is some small action, whereas a turn is, you know, I'm at a T-junction, I'm going to turn 90 degrees. And again, you can sort of see that actually, for some of these signals, which ones? These are old slides. Dot, dot, turn right. So yeah, for the big actions, it's doing fairly well. Seems to be biased to turning in one direction, but let's not worry about that. And also, braking. It's really good at predicting when to brake. And what you get is you can look at these activations, and this is where it starts to get interesting. So this is the activation for a pedestrian crossing. And so you should just be able to see the image underneath. And this is when the classifier said, yep, pedestrian crossing, we basically back projected it, and this is the parts of the image that were stimulating it. And what you see is it's lighting up on the pedestrian crossing along the floor. You've got this linear feature, which is this, and that thing in the top, which looks like the sun. Well, it's not the sun. We would conjecture, well, we think it's just context recognition, because actually you tend not to get pedestrian crosses out of the city, pedestrian crossings out of the city, and so actually a good indicator that you're in a city is that actually you've got buildings on either side. So we think this is actually just the machine learning something about the context that it's in. But you're kind of guessing, because you know, we're trying to interpret. Then what we did is we sort of said, right, well, actually, can we get this to control a vehicle? So we took one of these little autonomous robots. We drove it round. We trained the system. So it's got gist coming in. It's got control parameters coming out. We trained it, and then we said, right, off you go, control yourself. And so this now is it controlling itself. And then what happens, well, what's interesting is looking at the activation. Because remember, it's just taking whole images in. We've not told it to track the road. And this is what it's using to make its decisions. And the nice thing is that it is using, it's picked up on these road markings on the road. It's also firing on these other things. And what I would say is this is a very small room. It's gone round and round and round again. It's basically memorized the room. So it's using some of the landmarks of the room to make its decisions. It's not wholly using the track. But then we took this into a car. So I drove round, because from a reviewer's point of view, well, that's a bit staged, isn't it? You've drawn white lines on the floor. That's easy. So I drove round Surrey lanes with no markings, and we did the same thing. And this is the prediction of the system after it had trained. Bit Heath Robinson, like me Heath Robinson signs. Camera in the back on a tripod, must look like a nutter. Some post-it notes on the steering wheel, bit of OCR on the odometer, you know, it's proper science. And this is the activation map. And the nice thing is that it is using the sides of the road. It is using the lane mark, but it also fixates on the vanishing point. You know, so it is looking down the bottom of the road. But can you draw any more conclusions than that? I don't know. what about going back to that eye gaze data? The eye gaze data that was completely useless, right? So actually, we've got an activation map now that says where the machine is looking to make its decisions. And what we can start to do is look at the correlation between that and the humans. Because the trouble is that our data is swamped by rubbish. You know, we spend most of our time looking at nothing, but we do attend. We do look at things when they're important. And so what you've got here is standard and state-of-the-art saliency measures, things like ITI and NOC. You know, and these are things in the literature that says this is how you should calculate what is important in an image. And then what we've got is the output from this system and how good it is at predicting where the user looks. And what you see is much, much better correlations between the machine learning and the human than any of these standard saliency measures that are in the literature. So the machine is looking at the same things that we're looking. And you can also we did some other experiments and we looked at prediction. So it turns out that actually training the system, the best prediction time is about 650 milliseconds, and that's about the same as human reaction time. But, I mean, you could deliberately take that out of the system and retrain it. The nice thing is actually you can start to predict what the human is going to do before the human actually does it without too much of a drop in performance. I'm running out of time. Depends how interested you are. So I'm going to speed up a bit then. So that was that, and then more recently we stopped with the cars and we moved to robotics. So do you know what Mcl Multicolor Localization is? Do you care what Multicolor Localization is? Should I tell you, or should I just skip over it? Anyone? Nobody? Okay. Yeah. Right answer. I don't know which way that went, but I'm just going to do what I do anyway. So, okay, so MCL, multicolor localization, is I want to know where I am in a room, and basically I'm going to do that in a probabilistic domain, and the way I'm going to do that is by basically sampling, right? So each one of these little red points is representing how likely it is that I am there. So when it starts off, they're randomly scattered, it has no idea. And then what it's using is a motion model, how the robot is moving, and importantly, some sensors, right, that are measuring observations in the scene. And what you can see that as this thing iterates, it gradually converges upon where the actual robot is, right? So that's a fairly standard robotic approach to localization, integrating the sensory, the locomotion of the robot, because that gives you sensible constraints, with some sensor, and that sensor is either a LiDAR or Kinect or something like that. Now the problem with these things is that here is a LiDAR. LiDARs are expensive, right? And if you look in the automotive, sector, everyone, how many autonomous cars have got LiDARs on? Velodyne is desperately trying to get these things cheap enough for a mass market. You've got Ouster, lots of other people coming in. Solid-state LiDARs are coming, because at the moment, LiDAR is not cheap enough to deploy en masse for autonomous vehicles, level 5 autonomy. But the real question is a LiDAR required? In this context of robotics, right, that robot having a LiDAR is akin to me having a floor plan of the building and then going, I have no idea where I am, but I've got a tape measure. I'm a metre from that wall, and I'm 2 metres from there. Right, that means I could be here. I'll move a bit, I'll take another measurement, and going around with this tape measure. We don't do that. How do we do it? We use much higher level semantic cues. Right? So when I walk around, I stand in a corridor, I go, right, I'm in a big linear thing. Well, there's one of them on the floor plan. I can see 3 doors and a window. I could be here, I might be there. I go around the corner, I see the toilet, I know exactly where I am on that floor plan. We use much higher level cues than measuring to a wall. So what we did is exactly the same thing, and we used the neural network. So we can take an image like this, and then we can perform some semantic segmentation on it, and that basically just takes the pixels and says floor, wall, door, X, Y, Z, right? And we'll skip over this. Here we're cheating, we're using a Kinect and we're pretending it's a single LiDAR. So here is a Kinect RGB image, which goes through a neural network to get semantic segmentation. Here is the depth image, and then we're taking a single scan line along this to basically say we've got a depth and we've got some semantic label. And then what we want to do is put it into this Monte Carlo localization. And if you've got the depth information, that's really easy. So here what we've got are distance maps. These are chamfer maps that basically say how far is every point to the closest door, to the closest wall. And that just makes it efficient. It's just an efficient representation. And here what you can do is you say, well, I can see from my perception, I can see a door at 3 meters, and you can look at this and say, well, how likely is it there's a door at 3 meters? Not very likely, right? So this is probably not where I am. Where it becomes interesting is if you haven't got that depth measurement, because we don't want the tape measure. And so the way you do that is you ray cast. I can now just cast rays into my map and say, do I touch a door? Do I touch a wall? And I don't need this depth information. And it's like, good old-fashioned map reading. I'm stood somewhere and I say, well, I can see a steeple and I can see a mountain. I must be somewhere about here. And then I move a bit and I get another cue, and that allows me to increase my accuracy. So what you get is a robot then that can actually localize itself without depth measurements. And here you see that MCL particle filter starting and converging. And here what we've got, this is state-of-the-art MCL. Here is us using range data, so we're using that depth. And here it is just doing that ray casting. So it's just using the semantic cues. And it's almost as accurate as if we had the depth data. And you can just see here, so this is the robot going around, and the camera. You can see here that we're not using this depth data, but we're overlaying it over the map. I don't know why it stops there. I was trying to fix it on the train, but you can see how well this thing is lining up with the floor plan. Gives you an indication of how well it's it's localized. Now this has led on to one of our current projects, which is autonomous valet-parking. And this is a partnership. The main partner is Parkopedia. I don't know whether you used their app before. But Parkopedia are interested in parking. The clue's in the name. But the problem is that a lot of parking spaces are GPS denied. Right? So if you think a multi-story car park, you haven't got a GPS signal, so you can't localize with that. And they are thinking towards the future with how is your car going to do this automatically. So this project aims in 2 years to show level 4 autonomy. And level 5 is complete madness, right? So that's when the car is completely in control. You haven't even got a steering wheel. Level 4 is almost there, but it's within restricted domains. So this is, the use case here is that, and this is what we will demonstrate, is you turn up at your multi-story car park, you get out your car, you press park, it will enter the multi-story car park, it will negotiate it, it will find a parking space, it will park itself. And then when you've finished your meeting, you will recall the car, it will extricate itself from the car park, and it will pick you up from your meeting, and you will drive it off home. Right? And this builds on this semantic localization because it's GPS denied, and we will not be using LiDAR. Right? So the idea is to do this from cameras alone. Now, Parkopedia have got, I don't know whether you've come across Street Drone 1, so they've got a test vehicle. Because I'm slightly mad, I just decided we would build our own. No offense to Street Drone, but it was quite expensive, and I went, I can build my own for a tenth of that price. And then Brian at Parkopedia went, are you mad? And then my PhD went, you did your PhD with him, you know he's mad. So we now have a Twizy in the lab, and just getting that down the corridor is a comedy video in itself. But it's currently got panels missing, the PX2's arrived, the LiDAR's there. My wife's getting very annoyed because there's a lot of electronics on the mantelpiece at home, which will be the odometry box. She's under express instructions not to touch it, and she's been very good so far. She's got a PhD, and she's been with me a long time, so she understands. Yeah, so this will be our test bed. And actually what we've been doing at the moment is looking, so this is a semantic segmentation. This is the Apolloscape data. And not dissimilar to what we do in the robot. But actually, we're trying to take this one stage further, and we've been embedding these features. Now, this is not a semantic segmentation that is created by a human. This is a visualization of a feature space that the machine has learned. And all we've told it is that these points in the image are the same points, and I want you to be able to tell these from these other things. And it's effectively just a contrastive loss, and it's gone through and learnt these feature representations. And that, well, this is a stereo. I don't know. The trouble is that we can only visualize it in 3D. It works best in 30 dimensions. So, but basically, rather than us saying this is a tree, we are telling it to try and learn from this. The nice thing is it does some great things. I mean, this is still ongoing work, but because I'm going to come back to it, but it's using the context of the scene. It's looking at the whole image. It's not just like a standard feature detector. You know, if you're going to run visual odometry, then corners or, you know, or orb slam, you know, some local statistics. This thing is making decisions based on the context of the image, and that's actually quite cool. But we've done some, we can embed these in a map, and then this is an image that has come in and we've put through the neural network and told it to convert to our feature representation. And this is a synthetic, this is this model that has been rendered from the same position. And hopefully what you can see is these two things are the same. You know, this is still ongoing work, but you can sort of see, without me telling it about trees, all the trees are green. And that's coincidence that they're green. The important thing is that all the vegetation has the same feature representation. It's learning this itself. And we just, I mean, this was at ECCV. It was only at one of the workshops, and we're still working on it. And although this is cool, I don't think this is the right way to do it, not for the AVP project. We started off in 2D, we've gone to 3D, and where I want to be is 2.5D, some sort of parametric representation, because that's actually what's going to make it scale. So, solved. Is it solved? I've run out of time, but there's only a few slides, and these are the cool ones now, so you really want to see these. So, is everything solved? Well, vision has moved an awful lot, right? So we started off with hard-coded, engineered solutions, and this was when I came in. Actually, you've heard this famous quote, and don't blame me, Mike Brady, if you didn't say it, but you know, it's an urban myth. Mike Brady, in the old days, said, if it works on one image, it's an MPhil. If it works on two, it's a PhD. You know, and they are the days where we were engineering solutions to problems. We've then gone to this idea of learning, but we had, you know, I'm thinking bag of words here. All of the all of these features we were engineering to be invariant to this, to be good to that. And then we were throwing it into pieces of machine learning. And where we are now is in this full end-to-end, right? So basically, it's a big black box. Throw some stuff into it, it'll make some decisions. So the question is, does this solve the problem? And we all know the answer is no, don't we? So have you seen this? Hoggles, right? This was a really good paper. So this is going back to that intermediate one where humans engineered the features, right? So, and this is what we were driving that car around with. This is a hog representation. So we've taken an image, we've calculated some orientation histograms over that image, and this is a visualization of them. And this paper from 2013 was really good in that they sort of said, well, what does the computer actually see? So this is what the image looks like to the machine if you reconstruct it from these features. So you can see the amount of information loss that's going on in the machine. And actually that looks pretty good. You think, wow, that's all right. I can recognize that. You know, so this representation is pretty damn good. But then what they did is they started to look at the failure cases. So here is an image of it's not a duck, it's a goose, isn't it? And there is a car in the water, right? Now, you live in Bath, Bath's nice. I live in Guildford, Guildford's nice. If we lived in Birmingham, there might be a car in the water, but you know, not where we live. It just wouldn't happen. So, but what they did is, if you take this image patch, which is this, convert it to hog, and then revisualize it, then it starts to look a bit like a car. And so actually, well, you think, well, the machine learning was doing all right. It was just an artifact. And all of the hand engineering that went on here to produce something that was lighting invariant and invariant to this, basically normalized the hell out of this flat piece of image and produced an artifact that looked like a car. Here's some more cars, and here's the images that they came from. These are great. These are people. You know, and these look, you know, here's somebody with a shopping bag, sort of walking to that side. And it looks like they've got a hand in the air. Yeah, I can see lots in there. And then you look where they came from. You know, so the machine learning is actually not doing a bad job. It was given some data. It was given some features that threw away a lot of information. So it was doing the best it could. But CNNs have got their own issues. You know, so performance now has gone through the roof, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen, you know, things like adversarial attacks. So you can train a neural network, and it works really, really well, and it beats everything else. And then what you can do is you can take a very good image with high confidence. You can make a minor modification to it, and you can get the machine to completely misclassify this thing. And this has caused such a fuss because of the safety and trust issues, especially if our level 5 autonomy is going to have any of this technology in there. I mean, some other examples, and this was, I had a guy, Matt had his PhD last week, and so I pulled him out of his thesis. A girl is eating a zebra on the ground. I mean, this is a state-of-the-art sentence generation system that performs really, really well on the MS COCO data set, and on the leaderboard looks really good. You still look at the failure cases, not doing, you know, busy street with a street with a street. It's kind of there. It's not really English though, is it? And then tracking, which don't do. So last time he made me come and talk about tracking. But actually tracking, is, you've seen this one before. This is a great one, right? So how good is that tracker? So it's tracking a really complex motion. You know, there's lots of deformable motion of the thing. But then if I just put my finger there, then actually you realise it's not a tracker. It's not tracking it. It's just a red box drawn on the image. And actually the person that's doing the tracking is the cameraman or woman. You know, they're following the object. And actually, if you put this into a tracker, then there's so much motion it'll just collapse. But these things are easy for us because we use the context. I know that the camera is tracking, and we did do. You know, this was another one where we looked at the causal relationships between things that are going on in the image. So Carell looking particularly happy. And what we made him do is turn around so you can't see the cup anymore. And as a human, I can still guess where the cup is. And the idea is that I'm using other cues. And this is slightly staged in that what the system is doing is, although it starts tracking the cup, it learns that there is a nonlinear relationship between the reflection in the window and the cup. And once it's learned that relationship, it can then start to predict the motion of the cup from the thing that it's tracking in the window. And then when he turns around and the cup can no longer be seen, which he might do, there, he turns around. So we can no longer track the cup, but we can still have a damn good guess of where it actually is because we've got other evidence in the image. Now this is very staged, but these are good examples of, as a human, I am not tracking like a 5x5 pixel window. I am using the context of the image, of what's going on to make decisions. And I can track anything. You know, if I want to track a point on a cheek, I don't need 4K so I can see the pores. All I need to know is that actually there is a relationship between it and other things, and I can make a damn good guess at where it's going. What's that an image of? Come on, you're humans, you're supposed to be good at this. That's a good question. All right, so you can't tell what it is, but can you tell me what the depth ordering of the pixels are in that image? Dark one's further, is it? So the one on the left is further. Because this is exactly the sort of question that typically we ask a machine to do. Right, what's this? And could you reconstruct the depth, single view reconstruction? So if I now show you this image, right, and I tell you, well, actually it came from there, and I can now sort of extrapolate down, and I think actually that tree is in front of that one, I think. So I think that these points are actually in front of those, and that would also be supported by the fact that because of the haze, that these ones are actually slightly more whited out, so that gives me some additional depth cues. And the important thing here is that we're not doing it from this. I am using the context of the scene. I am using this haze and the fact that there is some sort of like linear, was it in graphics, wasn't it? It's linear for mist, logarithmic for fog. But so there's some linear relationship with how this light is diffused that gives me additional depth cues, and I'm integrating all of this information. Right. I want you to watch this video, and before you watch it, nobody gets hurt. Okay? Nobody gets hurt. That's probably enough. So, how many people are on the platform? 4? It was 4, then it went to 5, and then finally 6. How many benches were there? There were 2. How many hanging baskets of flowers were there? 2. Well, actually, there were none. But the fact that you're answering all these questions, I should say, you heartless man. But the whole point was that actually all of that information was completely irrelevant. When you watch that, within the I gave you quite a strong prior that something was going to happen, but you knew exactly what was going to go wrong as soon as you saw that pram moving, and that probably captured most of your attention. And this is just another sort of like version of the the classic selective attention sort of like psychology. But the whole point is that we are doing things much more complex than just looking at individual pixels. So what do you see here? It's not a trick question, and you're not heartless. Although I did get accused of being sexist at a Vim meeting over this. Do you remember? Because I said a lady hanging out the washing. So it should be it's a person, and it just happens that the clip art has a lady, but this could be any sort, it could be anybody. I put the washing out just as, not as much as mobile, but I do put the washing out. And so if I gave this to a piece of machine learning, that sentence generator that was trained on MS Cocoa, it might say woman, hanging out, washing, boy, football. But I can sort of start to change this scene subtly now. And importantly, what I want to do is ask the system, so what will the woman's emotion be in 60 seconds time? And actually that is so far away from where we currently are. And we've talked, so the Vim network, we've talked about this idea of kind of visual Turing tests, and I think that's where we need to go, because it's more, object recognition. Is it solved? It's pretty, it's pretty damn good. But really the level of intelligence that we've got is much more about seeing and more about understanding. It's not just about the percepts, it's also about the reasoning. And that brings me on to DARPA, right? Because I've just been writing a proposal, and this goes back to the semantic gap. And I didn't want to say the semantic gap, this classic thing. How do you unify? And actually, DARPA put it quite elegantly in that they propose that, they sort of talk about 3 waves of AI. This is the last slide. And wave 1 was the old stuff. That's when vision broke away, and it was about creating engineering solutions and reasoning, and it had these kind of things. So it wasn't very good at perceiving. It was great at reasoning, right? But it was rubbish at learning because it all had to be hard-coded. And then wave 2 is the statistical, and more recently the deep learning. And a good example here is, this is chess. It's a nice deterministic system. It's like there is an algorithm. Okay, it's complex, but with some heuristics, we can make some progress in this search space. AlphaGo, the complexity is so high that it's really just about pattern matching, right? But the deep learning sort of like is great for perception, great for learning, rubbish for abstraction and reasoning. And where we need to go is this wave 3. So a wave 3 architecture, which kind of brings back together. We've got to go back to some of our roots and try and take the strength of deep learning and put it together with some of this lower stuff. And actually that's part of the interpretability as well, because yeah, we've got to sort of unpick. They can't all just be black boxes. So in conclusion, so vision has made huge advances in the last 5 years. Computers, you know, in many areas have surpassed humans. Whether we like it or not, neural networks are around for a while. But we don't, there's lots of things we don't have. Nothing is solved. So we don't have a generic learning machine. We don't know how to bridge these gaps between kind of, you know, semantic and reasoning and deep learning and a generic perceptual reasoning framework. You know, we can't do this. I want a machine that can understand and predict and empathize with what's going on in the image. And I think that's it. And I am sorry I overran a little, but I have finished now. You are.